Virtual collaboration, whether through Skype, FaceTime, BlueJeans, or the ubiquitous Zoom, is something we've all found ourselves diving into lately. According to Stanford economist Nicholas Bloom, 42% of Americans are working from home right now. And on average, CEOs expect 36% of their employees to remain at home until at least January 2022. With that sort of longevity on the horizon, it's critical that we up our collaboration game, and this video will help you do just that. First, we'll review the building blocks of effective communication. Then, we'll take a look at some best practices informed by social science research. Ready? Let's get started. At the heart of all collaboration is interpersonal communication. You may be familiar with Shannon and Weaver's linear model, or at least what it's based on, the old-fashioned telephone call. It works something like this. A sender, the person creating the message, encodes, puts into symbols and gestures, a message, the information being transmitted, sending it through a channel, the medium through which the message passes, to a receiver, the person attending to the message, who decodes or makes sense of the message, all while contending with noise, distractions that disrupt transmission. But is communication really that simple? If you're giving a speech, maybe, but not if you're having a conversation. The challenges of the environment, as well as the reality of taking turns being the source and the receiver, create complications that aren't accounted for in the linear model. That's where the transactional model comes in. Developed by Dean Barnlund in the 1970s, this model considers 4 different types of noise: psychological, which can take the form of defensiveness; physiological, such as illness, fatigue, and hearing loss; physical, which could be interruptions from others or sirens whizzing by on the streets outside; and semantic noise, which occurs when 2 or more people have different interpretations for the same word or concept, as can happen between collaborators from different cultures, co-cultures, or generations. So why is this important? First and foremost, the most consequential part of communicating is listening. Don't spend the entire time waiting for someone else to stop talking so you can plow through what you want to say. Be adaptable, be flexible. Don't be this guy.
Positive and negative, does it always react in a non-spontaneous characteristic?
Kyle, sweetie, did you do your laundry?
Shut the f*** up, Mom! I'm in a class!
Second, all of these various forms of noise can affect the mood and mindset of your conversational counterparts. Let me give you some examples. Are others working nearby, chit-chatting, and breaking their ability to concentrate? That's physical noise. Are they on their 9th hour of Zoom meetings for the day? That's physiological noise. Are they frazzled because their spouse or partner is liable to embarrass them at any time? That's psychological noise. All of these factors can affect behavior in ways that appear to be personally motivated, but speak to unique circumstances more than the innate qualities of your collaborators. Which leads us to our next tip. Don't make assumptions. Sometimes your counterpart's mood has nothing to do with you or the topic at hand, but we have a way of assuming that it does. This is known as correspondence bias, or the fundamental attribution error. It works like this. Imagine it's pre-COVID times and we're all back at the office. Your coworker, Katie, stumbles in 30 minutes late and blows right by your desk without stopping to say hello. You assume she overslept, watched too much TV, or otherwise did something that paints her as lazy and feckless. But the next morning, you have a meeting scheduled with the boss and you run into tons of trouble. First, your alarm clock doesn't go off at the right time. Then you miss your train. Finally, you make it to work and notice your boss frowning as she looks at her watch. And then you realize something. When unfortunate circumstances fall on us, we tend to give ourselves a pass. It wasn't me, it was the alarm on my phone, etc. In other words, we consider situational causes for our own behavior. But when misfortune finds others, we usually attribute the consequences to dispositional factors. In other words, to the very core of their being, their temperaments, their personalities. We're even more likely to make this mistake when the subject is a woman, while we're susceptible to giving men a pass for the slights they commit. So, how do you reduce correspondence bias? Get to know your collaboration counterparts as people, not just as objects on the other side of the screen. This may involve icebreakers, but the most important element is appreciative inquiry. Well, what does this mean in plain English? Be nice. Ask open-ended questions that aren't related to project deliverables or client satisfaction. Closely related to the concept of appreciative inquiry is confirming communication, which are messages that uplift and affirm the humanity of your conversational counterpart. In order of least to most valuing messages, these are messages of recognition, welcoming people into the virtual meeting, letting others know that you'll be back shortly if you need to go off camera. Messages of acknowledgement, soliciting people's opinions, empathetic listening. And finally, messages of endorsement, agreeing, allying, complimenting. One caveat here though, these techniques work best in cultures with explicit and direct communication, like the US and Canada, and less well in East Asia and parts of the Middle East. Proximity is also important. Position yourself so that people can see your eyes and other facial details through the camera. Research indicates that creating this sort of physical intimacy, even if it's virtual, increases pro-social responses. Finally, be aware of rambling and other distancing responses, which are easier to commit when social cues are less apparent, as they are in the virtual world. This can lead to negative spirals, or something anthropologists refer to as schismogenesis, where one disconfirming response begets another, even more distancing response, and on and on. Here are some specific patterns to avoid. Tangential responses. This is where you offer no acknowledgement to what the other person just said, and instead use their comments to address a new topic that's more interesting to you. Irrelevant responses, which exhibit no listening at all. For example, responding, "What are you having for lunch?" after a team member asks you about the budget for your project. Impersonal responses, such as saying, "You win some, you lose some," to someone who's just been laid off. Ambiguous responses, like maybe or perhaps instead of yes or no. And incongruous responses, which offer two sets of conflicting messages. For example, saying, "Yes, I'd love to give that presentation," while nodding no and gritting your teeth. Disconfirming communications such as these are not only counterproductive, they also cause pain signals to flare in recipients' brains, just as if they'd fallen off a bicycle and bruised their knee. Ouch. How do you know if you're giving disconfirming responses though? And if you are, how can you cut down on them? This is where meta-observation can come in handy. All that means is jotting down some thoughts about your virtual interactions shortly after they've happened. Think of it like an anthropological expedition on yourself. You can use Word, Google Docs, Evernote, whatever you want. When you log your interactions, try and make observations using the 4 levels of interpretation. First is the self. How are you feeling, irrespective of how the conversation's going? Second is interpersonal interaction. How is the collaboration going? What's the dynamic between the team members? Third is the group. Is the team coalescing? What stage are you in? Storming, forming, norming, performing? And finally, think about the system. What's happening out there that may be affecting the social climate in here? For instance, if your team lacks diversity and this is causing you cognitive dissonance, chances are this is a structural problem, even though it may manifest as an individual or team level problem. Try to record at least 2 interactions per day for 2 weeks and see if you notice any patterns. Practice seeing things at the systemic level to add an additional layer of understanding to your interactions. Remember, the dominant culture in the US is highly individualistic. This means we're often better at zooming in, focusing on problems of the person, than we are at zooming out, noticing broader issues and working to mitigate them where we can. This is related to the fundamental attribution error that we discussed earlier, which pushes us to see everything that's going wrong as someone's fault. And if we zoom out, we can see that this is also the foundation of the self-fulfilling prophecy, which functions as the lodestone of racism and discrimination. If you do choose to engage in meta-observation, make sure you record your impressions right away. Don't wait days or hours after the meeting to note your thoughts. You see, the experiencing self is different from the remembering self in some important ways, and this can skew your perceptions and therefore the accuracy of your impressions. Now let's look at perception more broadly, which involves peeling back the onion to examine the process of decision-making. We're going to talk about dual process thinking, which sounds like a super complex concept, but it's actually pretty simple. Imagine there are two routes that messages take when they enter your consciousness. Social psychologist Daniel Kahneman calls them System 1 and System 2. Jonathan Haidt calls them the rider and the elephant. And the elaboration likelihood model, which is usually applied to mass media, calls them the central route and the peripheral route. These cognitive models all work in the same way. When we receive a piece of information, if it's truly important to us and our cognitive strain is sufficiently low, meaning we're not too tired or too distracted, we'll process it through the central route, or what Kahneman calls System 2. This is where reasoned, deliberate thinking happens, like carefully computing our tax refund, or rehearsing the way we're going to ask for a raise. But what if we didn't get any sleep, the baby's crying in the background, or the other person is discussing something that we just don't care about? You know, all those sources of communications noise we talked about earlier. Then we'll use System 1 to process the information, which is quick, automatic, and prone to errors known as heuristics. One heuristic would be availability, in which we estimate how common an event is based on how many times we hear about it. For instance, many people think that airplane crashes are far more common than they are because they remember seeing coverage of these stories on the news. We also use System 1 thinking when the answer to a problem is just plain hard, and we don't want to invest the sort of effortful thinking necessary to arrive at the most accurate answer. Evidence from the RAND Corporation also suggests that we're more likely to use automatic thinking in computer-mediated communication than we are in person. So how do you break through this paradigm and convince people to seriously consider what you have to say? First, ask questions of your collaborators. Keep them engaged. Second, help them assume some ownership of the conversation. Don't make all the decisions on your own. Finally, and most importantly, read your audience. Frame the discussion so that it has some resonance to them. Finally, communication also relies on frames and metaphors, often in ways that escape our conscious awareness. For instance, we all know that when a coworker says the boss is hard-headed, she doesn't literally mean that their head can bore through a wall. But how about these metaphors, which have become so common in American business that we seldom consider why we use them? We scored a touchdown during that pitch meeting. Our presentation was a slam dunk. Let's send a landing team over to accounting to sort out the numbers. It's important to consider that cultures where athletics and the military aren't as central. Communications researcher Geert Hofstede calls them feminine cultures. May not understand some of these references. Even societies with different sports obsessions may get tied up on some of these phrases. Imagine, for instance, that you're collaborating with a colleague based in Brazil. For one thing, the dominant sport in Latin America is soccer, not American football. But this culture also differs from the dominant US culture in other ways, like placing a bit more emphasis on the good of the group versus the good of each person, a cultural dimension known as collectivism. Being more comfortable with hierarchies and rigid authority, which is called power distance. Even language use is different. Your colleague may speak English, but due to her culture, she may include less explicit detail in her words, relying on paralanguage instead, body language, tone of voice. This is called high context communication, and it's one more reason to pay extra close attention when you're collaborating virtually. By embracing multiple levels of identity, especially during cross-cultural interactions, you'll improve intercultural understanding. This is also true, by the way, for co-cultures inside the US. Meta-observation will also help you here, because they give you an opportunity to notice the natural patterns in your interactions, and hopefully enough focus to tailor them to the situation at hand.
Can everyone hear me? But we'll try and at least discuss.
Guys, what happened? She left the meeting. Yeah, she left the meeting.
Listen, don't make assumptions. Get to know the human side of your virtual collaborators. Take steps to minimize emotional distance. Engage your collaborators, get them involved, and be mindful of cultural differences. Oh, and one more thing. Check those internet connections and create a backup source if possible. Because even second graders have meetings these days, and they may know a little bit more about Zoom than us adults do. Thanks for listening, and best of luck in the ever-evolving virtual world.